The quickest way to bury the truth is to laugh at the person carrying it. On a cool autumn morning in Richmond, Virginia, sunlight filtered through the tall courthouse windows and painted long rectangles across polished marble floors as people quietly filled the county courtroom for another routine civil hearing. Attorneys organized folders, reporters checked their notebooks, and families whispered among themselves while waiting for the judge to enter. Near the back of the room sat Harold Bennett, an 82-year-old white American veteran whose faded navy blazer looked older than many of the people around him. Resting carefully on a polished wooden cane, he held a small weathered oak box against his chest with both hands, as though it contained something far more valuable than metal. The corners of the box had been worn smooth by decades of careful handling, yet Harold never once glanced down at it. Instead, his eyes rested calmly on the American flag standing beside the judge's bench. When the bailiff called the room to order, everyone rose except Harold, who needed an extra moment before slowly pushing himself upright. No one noticed the quiet determination in the movement except Emily Carter, the 31-year-old court clerk organizing documents beside the bench. She watched the elderly veteran settle back into his chair with measured dignity before returning her attention to the morning docket. Harold had come to verify military decorations required for a veterans benefits review after an old government archive had requested renewed documentation. It should have been a simple administrative process lasting only a few minutes. Instead, the hearing took an unexpected turn when Judge Richard Coleman opened the small wooden box and carefully lifted several aged military medals into the courtroom light. The ribbons had faded with time, and tiny scratches covered the bronze and silver surfaces, evidence of years spent tucked away rather than proudly displayed. Judge Coleman examined each piece with growing skepticism before placing them on the evidence table. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Harold. "Mr. Bennett," he said in a firm, measured voice that carried across the silent courtroom, "these medals appear inconsistent with the official examples presented to this court. Based on their condition and several visible irregularities, I have serious reason to believe they are not authentic." A quiet murmur spread through the gallery as strangers exchanged uncertain glances. One reporter immediately began writing while another leaned forward for a better view. Harold remained completely still. His hands rested quietly on the handle of his cane, and his expression never changed. Judge Coleman continued speaking. "Until proper verification is provided, this court cannot recognize these decorations as genuine military awards." The words settled heavily over the room. Emily looked from the medals to Harold's face, expecting anger, confusion, or desperate protest. None came. The elderly veteran simply reached toward the table after receiving permission, gently gathered each medal one at a time, and returned them to the worn oak box with extraordinary care. Every movement was slow, respectful, and practiced, as though he had repeated the ritual countless times over the years. He closed the lid softly and rested one weathered hand upon it before quietly saying, "Thank you for your time, Your Honor." His calm response felt strangely out of place. There was no argument, no attempt to defend himself, and no bitterness in his voice. Emily felt an unexpected uneasiness settle into her thoughts because she had seen dishonest people react with fear and honest people react with outrage, but she had never seen anyone respond with such peaceful certainty. As Harold slowly reached for his cane and prepared to leave the courtroom, she found herself wondering whether the oldest man in the room was also the only one who already knew that the truth never needed to raise its voice. Harold Bennett slowly rose from the wooden chair, steadying himself with his polished cane before lifting the weathered oak box once more. The quiet click of the brass latch echoed softly through the courtroom as though it marked the end of a conversation that had never truly begun. Without looking toward the gallery or the reporters gathering their notes, he adjusted his faded navy blazer and began making his way toward the courtroom doors. Every careful step reflected the weight of age, yet nothing about his posture suggested defeat. He walked with the quiet confidence of someone who had long ago learned that dignity did not depend upon another person's opinion. Emily Carter remained seated behind the clerk's desk, but her eyes followed him across the polished marble floor. Something continued to trouble her. During several years working inside the courthouse, she had watched countless hearings involving forged documents, false testimony, and fabricated military records. The reactions were almost always predictable. People argued. They raised their voices. They demanded another chance. Some became angry while others became frightened. Harold had done none of those things. He had accepted the judge's words without visible frustration, almost as though he already knew that today's hearing would not be the final chapter. Emily quietly excused herself under the pretense of organizing evidence before walking toward the table where the medals had rested only moments earlier. She replayed the hearing in her mind. Judge Coleman had pointed to small differences in ribbon colors and engraving styles that appeared inconsistent with modern reference photographs. The observations had sounded reasonable at first. Yet as Emily remembered the careful way Harold had handled every medal, another possibility slowly entered her thoughts. Those decorations had not looked like recently manufactured replicas. They looked old. They looked worn by time itself. She glanced toward the courtroom entrance, just in time to see Harold pause briefly near the hallway windows overlooking the courthouse lawn. Sunlight reflected across the polished lid of the oak box as he rested one hand upon it before continuing toward the exit with the same patient rhythm. Emily could not explain why, but she suddenly felt that allowing him to leave without asking another question would be a mistake. She hurried into the hallway. "Mr. Bennett," she called gently. Harold stopped and turned with a polite smile that revealed neither disappointment nor resentment. "Yes, ma'am." Emily approached him carefully. "I hope you do not mind me asking, but why did you not challenge the judge? Most people would have." Harold looked toward the courthouse entrance where autumn leaves drifted across the stone steps outside. His answer came after a thoughtful pause. "Because arguing does not change the truth." Emily studied his face. "But those medals mean something to you." Harold smiled faintly. "The medals remind me of people. That matters more than convincing strangers." He rested one hand lightly against the oak box before continuing. "Recognition comes and goes. Memory stays with the people who lived it." Emily found herself without an immediate reply. There was no bitterness in his voice. No trace of wounded pride. Only quiet certainty. Harold tipped his head politely before beginning to walk again. As he disappeared through the courthouse doors into the crisp Virginia morning, Emily remained standing in the hallway watching until he reached the sidewalk. A strange feeling settled over her. She could not shake the belief that the elderly veteran had left behind more than unanswered questions. He had left behind a silence that demanded to be understood. Emily slowly returned to the courtroom, opened the case file one more time, and noticed something she had overlooked earlier. One medal contained a barely visible serial number stamped along the edge, so small that it had escaped everyone's attention during the hearing. She leaned closer beneath the desk lamp, copied the faded numbers onto a notepad, and stared at them for several long seconds before quietly reaching for the secure government verification directory. For the first time that morning, she was no longer trying to confirm whether the medals were false. She was beginning to wonder if the courtroom had just questioned the wrong man. Emily Carter carefully entered the faded serial number into the secure government verification directory, expecting the system to return a simple confirmation or rejection within a few seconds. Instead, the screen remained blank longer than usual before a small notification appeared requesting elevated authorization. She frowned. Military decorations from earlier conflicts occasionally required archived records, but she had never encountered a basic verification request that immediately exceeded courthouse access privileges. She tried once more, carefully checking every digit she had copied from the edge of the medal. The same message appeared. Restricted record. Additional clearance required. Emily leaned back in her chair and quietly closed the courtroom door before picking up the internal government directory. She located the verification office assigned to historical military awards and placed the call. After several transfers, a calm voice answered. "Military Decorations Verification Division. This is Angela Morris speaking." Emily explained that she was assisting with a courthouse verification involving an elderly veteran whose medals had been challenged during a hearing. Angela politely requested the serial number. Emily slowly read each digit exactly as engraved. Silence followed. Not ordinary silence, but the unmistakable sound of someone carefully reviewing information that carried unexpected importance. Finally, Angela spoke again, though her voice had noticeably changed. "Could you please repeat the owner's full name?" Emily glanced at the hearing documents. "Harold Bennett." Another pause followed, longer this time. Computer keys clicked rapidly before Angela returned. Miss Carter, I need you to remain on the line. Emily looked toward the courthouse entrance where Harold had disappeared only minutes earlier. Is something wrong? Angela answered carefully. I am not authorized to discuss the record, but I am forwarding this verification request to another office. Another office? Emily asked quietly. Yes, ma'am. The line became silent again except for distant voices in another room. Within moments, a different man introduced himself. This is Daniel Foster with the Department of Veterans Affairs Historical Records Office. I understand you are verifying medals belonging to Mr. Harold Bennett. Emily confirmed the information. Daniel requested the serial number once more before accessing a separate archive. His response came almost immediately. The medals themselves are authentic. Emily felt a wave of relief. Then the hearing made a mistake? Daniel hesitated. The situation is more complicated than that. Emily waited. Mr. Bennett's file contains restricted material that cannot be released through our office. Restricted after all these years? She asked. Yes. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. I need to transfer this inquiry. Emily could hear another secure connection opening. A different voice answered, firm and professional. Department of Defense Records Command. Daniel briefly summarized the situation before reading Harold Bennett's name aloud. The new officer interrupted almost immediately. Please hold. Several seconds passed before the officer returned with a question that caught Emily completely off guard. Is Mr. Bennett still at your courthouse? Emily turned toward the hallway. Through the tall windows, she could barely see Harold walking slowly across the front lawn toward the parking area. The weathered oak box tucked securely beneath one arm, while autumn leaves drifted across the sidewalk. He is leaving now, she replied. The officer's tone became noticeably more urgent while remaining perfectly controlled. Miss Carter, if possible, please ask him to remain nearby for a short time. Do not alarm him. Do not discuss this call. Simply ask whether he would be willing to wait. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. May I ask why? The officer answered with measured precision. Someone with appropriate authority needs to speak with Mr. Bennett personally. Before Emily could ask another question, the officer added one final sentence. Please understand that this matter is no longer being handled as a routine medal verification. The connection ended. Emily slowly lowered the receiver, her eyes fixed on the elderly veteran now approaching his aging sedan beneath the bright Virginia sky. Only minutes earlier, he had been dismissed as a man carrying questionable medals. Now multiple federal offices had quietly redirected his file upward through channels she had never imagined. And somewhere beyond the courthouse walls, someone important had already begun making preparations to come for Harold Bennett. Harold Bennett had almost reached his aging dark blue sedan when he heard footsteps approaching across the courthouse plaza. He turned slowly and found Emily Carter hurrying toward him, the autumn breeze lifting a few loose strands of her hair while dry leaves rolled quietly along the concrete. She stopped several feet away, careful not to appear alarmed. Mr. Bennett, she said with a polite smile, would you mind waiting just a little longer before leaving? There are still a few questions that may need clarification. Harold studied her expression for a brief moment. Years of experience had taught him that words often revealed less than silence. He nodded once. If someone still has questions, I can wait. Emily thanked him, and together they walked toward a shaded bench overlooking the courthouse lawn. The oak trees surrounding the building had already begun turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and the cool Virginia air carried the quiet scent of fallen leaves. Harold carefully lowered himself onto the bench, resting the weathered oak box across his knees while his cane leaned beside him. Emily sat at the opposite end, unsure how much she should say. The instructions had been clear. Do not discuss the call. Simply ask him to remain nearby. Inside the courthouse, however, events continued moving in ways no one expected. Judge Richard Coleman had already returned to his chambers when his courtroom assistant quietly informed him that the verification request had been transferred beyond the Department of Veterans Affairs. The judge paused in the middle of reviewing another case file. Transferred where? He asked. The Department of Defense, the assistant answered. Judge Coleman frowned. Military records occasionally required additional review, but such requests rarely advanced beyond ordinary administrative offices. He dismissed the thought and resumed reading, believing the matter would eventually confirm his earlier concerns. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away inside a secure military records facility, Harold Bennett's archive file had been retrieved from long-term storage. The thick folder showed the wear of decades, its edges softened by time, while several pages remained sealed beneath classification markings that had survived multiple generations of record-keeping. A senior records officer carefully compared the serial numbers from the medals against the original award documentation. Every engraving matched perfectly, every date aligned, every signature had been authenticated years before. Yet one page near the center of the file carried a handwritten notation that immediately changed the tone inside the office. The officer quietly picked up a secure telephone and placed another call. This time there was no discussion about whether the medals were genuine. The only question asked was whether the individual listed in the record was still alive. The answer came within moments. Confirmed. Harold Bennett is alive and currently present at the Richmond County Courthouse. Several seconds of silence followed before the response came back. Notify General Michael Hayes immediately. Back outside, Harold sat peacefully watching a small group of children chasing fallen leaves across a nearby lawn while their parents laughed from a distance. Emily noticed the gentle smile that crossed his face. "You like children?" she asked quietly. Harold nodded. "They remind me that every generation deserves a chance to grow without carrying yesterday's burdens." Emily looked at the oak box resting across his lap. "Have you always kept your medals with you?" Harold rested one weathered hand upon the lid. "Only when someone asks to see them." Before Emily could reply, the distant sound of approaching engines drifted across the quiet streets surrounding the courthouse. At first it was little more than a faint vibration carried by the cool afternoon air. Harold lifted his eyes toward the road without changing his expression. Emily followed his gaze, wondering why several people near the courthouse entrance had suddenly stopped what they were doing to look in the same direction. Neither of them spoke. Whatever was coming had not arrived by accident, and somewhere beyond the line of autumn trees, a journey had already begun that would soon reveal a truth buried for more than half a century. The distant engines grew, louder before gradually fading again as the vehicles slowed somewhere beyond the courthouse entrance. But Harold Bennett did not turn his head immediately. Instead, his fingers rested gently upon the weathered oak box, tracing one familiar corner that had been worn smooth through decades of quiet remembrance. The touch awakened memories that never truly disappeared. More than 50 years earlier, under a gray morning sky on the other side of the world, damp jungle air clung to every uniform while a steady mist drifted through towering trees. The smell of wet earth mixed with the sharp scent of burned fuel that lingered from the previous night's operation. Then Sergeant Harold Bennett had been a much younger man, moving carefully through dense terrain with the calm confidence earned by experience rather than rank. Behind him walked a newly commissioned lieutenant named Michael Hayes, barely 23 years old, intelligent, determined, and eager to prove himself. Like many young officers, Hayes trusted maps, radios, and carefully prepared plans. Harold trusted something different. He trusted silence, instinct, and the countless details that only years in the field could teach. As the patrol advanced through uneven ground, Harold suddenly stopped without speaking. The jungle itself seemed different. Birds that had filled the morning with sound had fallen silent. Even the wind appeared to hesitate among the leaves. Several soldiers looked toward their young lieutenant, waiting for instructions, but before Hayes could speak, Harold quietly raised one hand. Every man froze. For several long seconds no one moved. Finally, Harold pointed toward a section of ground ahead where the damp leaves rested in an unnatural pattern. He stepped closer, studying the smallest details before turning back. "We are changing direction," he said calmly. Hayes looked at the map. "Sergeant, that route takes us away from our planned approach." Harold nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir. Can you explain why?" Hayes asked. Harold looked toward the forest once more before answering. "Because something up there does not belong." The young lieutenant hesitated. Nothing visible supported Harold's judgment, yet the quiet certainty in the veteran's voice carried unusual weight. After a brief pause, Hayes made his decision. "We follow Sergeant Bennett." The patrol adjusted course, moving several hundred yards around the suspicious area before continuing toward its objective. Hours later, another unit reported discovering a concealed danger exactly where Harold had refused to lead his men. The realization spread quickly through the command structure. but Harold never mentioned it again. That evening, while several younger soldiers quietly thanked him, he simply smiled and said, "Getting everyone home is the only recognition worth chasing." Those words remained with Lieutenant Hayes long after the deployment ended. Throughout his military career, promotions came, responsibilities increased, and decades passed. Yet he often repeated Harold's lesson to younger officers. Every major decision he made began with one simple question: are you protecting the people beside you? Long before medals decorated his own uniform, Michael Hayes understood that true leadership had first been demonstrated by a quiet sergeant who never asked for applause. The memory faded as Harold blinked beneath the bright Virginia afternoon sun, returning to the courthouse bench where the same weathered hand still rested upon the oak box. Emily noticed the distant look in his eyes, but chose not to interrupt. Across the parking lot, courthouse employees had begun gathering near the entrance, their attention fixed on the road beyond the iron gates. The approaching vehicles were now clearly visible between rows of autumn trees, moving with steady purpose toward the courthouse. Harold watched them without surprise, almost as though he recognized that some promises made many years earlier could travel across decades before finally arriving exactly where they belonged. The first vehicle passed slowly through the courthouse gates without flashing lights or unnecessary display, followed by two dark military sport utility vehicles that moved with quiet precision across the parking lot. Their arrival drew the attention of everyone standing outside the building. Courthouse employees paused in the middle of conversations. Attorneys stepped onto the front steps. Reporters who had nearly finished packing their equipment immediately turned back toward the entrance, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Emily Carter watched the convoy approach with growing curiosity while Harold Bennett remained seated beneath the oak tree, his weathered hands resting calmly upon the old wooden box. The vehicles came to a smooth stop several yards from the courthouse entrance. Uniformed personnel stepped out first, scanning the area with calm professionalism before opening the rear passenger door of the lead vehicle. A tall man in a neatly pressed Army service uniform emerged with measured confidence. His silver hair reflected the afternoon sunlight, and the stars displayed upon his shoulders immediately caught the attention of anyone familiar with military rank. Conversations around the courthouse faded into complete silence. Several veterans who happened to be walking nearby instinctively straightened their posture. Emily recognized at once that this could only be the senior official mentioned during the secure telephone call. General Michael Hayes looked briefly toward the courthouse entrance before his eyes settled upon the elderly man waiting quietly beneath the tree. For just a moment, the commanding officer who had spent decades leading soldiers across the world no longer appeared focused on the surrounding crowd. His attention belonged entirely to Harold Bennett. Without hesitation, he began walking across the stone pathway with steady, deliberate steps. The military personnel accompanying him remained several paces behind, understanding without instruction that this meeting was deeply personal. Judge Richard Coleman, informed only moments earlier that a senior Army officer had unexpectedly arrived, stepped outside his chambers and walked toward the front entrance. He expected a formal administrative discussion regarding military documentation. Instead, he found courthouse staff standing silently along the windows, watching the scene outside unfold with quiet anticipation. Emily rose from the bench as General Hayes approached, but Harold remained seated for another moment, observing the familiar face drawing closer. Time had added gray hair and countless responsibilities to the younger lieutenant he had once known, yet the eyes were unmistakably the same. When General Hayes stopped several feet away, neither man spoke immediately. Their silence carried the weight of more than half a century, filled with memories that required no explanation. Harold slowly reached for his cane and carefully stood. Emily noticed that General Hayes waited patiently without attempting to assist him, offering instead the deeper respect of allowing the veteran to stand on his own terms. Once Harold was fully upright, the general smiled warmly. "It has been a long time, Sergeant Bennett," he said quietly. Harold returned the smile with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the day. "Yes, sir. Longer than either of us expected." Several people standing nearby exchanged confused glances. They had anticipated a formal greeting between strangers, not the quiet familiarity of two men who clearly shared a distant history. Judge Coleman stepped onto the courthouse steps just in time to witness the exchange. He noticed something unexpected in the general's expression. There was no uncertainty, no need to verify identities, and no interest in discussing paperwork. The highest-ranking officer present had already recognized the elderly veteran before speaking a single word. As a cool breeze stirred the American flag above the courthouse roof, General Hayes looked briefly toward the building where Harold's medals had been questioned only a short time earlier. Then he turned back toward the veteran and spoke with calm conviction that everyone nearby could hear. "Sergeant Bennett, I came because some truths deserve to be honored in person, not simply confirmed on paper." General Michael Hayes took one slow step forward until he stood directly in front of Harold Bennett. The courthouse lawn fell completely silent as every conversation stopped without anyone asking for quiet. Even the reporters lowered their cameras for a moment, sensing that whatever was about to happen deserved more respect than interruption. The general looked at the weathered oak box resting beneath Harold's hand before meeting the veteran's eyes once again. "Sergeant Bennett," he said, his voice steady enough to carry across the courtyard. "More than 50 years ago you taught a young lieutenant that rank could give authority, but character earned trust. I have carried that lesson every day since." Harold answered with a gentle smile that revealed neither pride nor surprise. "I only tried to keep good people alive, sir." General Hayes slowly shook his head. "You did much more than that." Without another word, the general stepped back exactly one pace. His polished shoes came together with practiced precision. His shoulders straightened. Then, before judges, attorneys, courthouse employees, reporters, and ordinary citizens, the four-star general raised his right hand in a flawless military salute directed entirely toward the elderly veteran standing quietly before him. Gasps spread softly through the gathering crowd. Judge Richard Coleman froze where he stood on the courthouse steps, unable to believe what he was witnessing. Emily Carter instinctively placed one hand over her heart. The soldiers accompanying the general immediately followed his example. One after another, every uniformed service member standing beside the vehicles came to attention and raised a salute toward Harold Bennett. No command had been given. None was necessary. Harold remained perfectly still for several seconds. His eyes reflected memories that stretched across decades, remembering friends who never returned home and countless names known only to those who had served beside them. Slowly, with careful movement shaped by age rather than hesitation, he released his cane long enough to raise his own right hand. His salute was steady, precise, and unmistakably practiced. It carried the quiet confidence of a soldier who had never forgotten the standards expected of him. The entire courtyard seemed to pause. Wind stirred the American flag above the courthouse roof, while fallen leaves drifted gently across the stone walkway between the two men. No applause broke the silence. No one reached for dramatic words. Respect alone filled the space between them. After lowering his salute, General Hayes turned toward the courthouse entrance where Judge Coleman remained standing. His voice stayed calm, free from accusation or anger. "Your Honor, the military decorations belonging to Sergeant Harold Bennett have been authenticated through original Department of Defense records. Every medal is genuine. Every citation is accurate. Several supporting documents remained under restricted protection for decades, which is why ordinary verification systems could not immediately access them." Judge Coleman listened without speaking. General Hayes continued, "The authenticity of these awards has never been in question within the official military archive. The delay existed only because history sometimes protects its witnesses more carefully than it reveals them." Emily glanced toward Harold, expecting satisfaction after hearing those words, but the veteran's expression remained unchanged. He looked neither triumphant nor vindicated. He simply rested one hand once again upon the weathered oak box as though nothing important had happened. General Hayes noticed the familiar gesture and smiled quietly. "I also came here for another reason," he said. "Some records explain what a soldier accomplished. They do not explain who made future leaders possible." Every eye remained fixed upon the general as he prepared to reveal the story that no medal, no document, and no official archive had ever fully captured. General Michael Hayes allowed the silence to linger for several moments before speaking again. His eyes moved from Harold Bennett to the people gathered outside the courthouse, making certain every word carried the weight it deserved. Most military records measure assignments, promotions, commendations, and years of service, he began calmly. Those records are important, but they do not tell the complete story of a person's legacy. He turned back toward Harold with unmistakable respect. When I first met Sergeant Bennett, I believed leadership came from the insignia on a uniform. I believed experience could be replaced by confidence. I was wrong. A faint smile crossed Harold's face, but he remained silent. General Hayes continued. During my first deployment, I made decisions by reading maps. Sergeant Bennett made decisions by reading people, weather, silence, and details that most of us never even noticed. More than once, his judgment prevented mistakes that could have changed many lives forever. Yet after every successful mission, he refused recognition. He always redirected praise toward the younger soldiers standing beside him. Several reporters quietly lowered their notebooks, realizing this was no longer simply a courthouse story. It had become the story of a lifetime. General Hayes looked toward Judge Richard Coleman. Your Honor, the medals inside that wooden box recognize official acts of service. What they cannot measure are the lives that continued because Sergeant Bennett chose wisdom over pride and responsibility over recognition. Judge Coleman listened without interruption, his earlier certainty replaced by thoughtful silence. Emily Carter noticed that even the courthouse staff had stopped moving. Every person present seemed unwilling to disturb the quiet dignity surrounding the elderly veteran. General Hayes continued speaking. After returning home, Sergeant Bennett declined opportunities that would have placed him in public attention. He trained younger service members, volunteered with veterans who struggled to rebuild their lives, and quietly attended memorial ceremonies for friends whose families often stood alone. He never asked for special treatment. In fact, many people who benefited from his guidance never knew the full history behind the man offering advice. Harold lowered his eyes for a moment, almost embarrassed by the attention. I simply did what many others would have done, he said softly. General Hayes smiled gently. That sentence explains your entire life. A few people near the courthouse entrance nodded without realizing it. The general stepped closer and placed one respectful hand upon the edge of the weathered oak box. I have visited military academies, command centers, and ceremonies across this country. Young officers often ask me where I learned the most important lesson of my career. They expect me to mention a famous commander or a battlefield victory. Instead, I tell them about a quiet sergeant who taught me that the greatest leaders are usually the last people to speak about themselves. Harold looked toward the American flag waving above the courthouse roof. The uniform belongs to the country, he said quietly. The medals belong to history. The lessons belong to the next generation. General Hayes nodded with deep appreciation. And that is exactly why your example still serves this nation. He then turned once more toward everyone gathered outside the courthouse. Today was never about correcting paperwork. It was about correcting perspective. Authentic medals can be verified by records. Authentic character can only be recognized by those willing to look beyond appearances. The courtyard remained completely silent. Judge Coleman slowly descended the courthouse steps, no longer carrying the confidence of a man certain he had been right. Instead, he approached Harold Bennett with the humility of someone who had finally understood that the greatest mistake made that morning had never been about military decorations. It had been about underestimating the quiet man who carried them. Judge Richard Coleman stopped a few feet in front of Harold Bennett and removed his glasses before speaking. The confidence that had filled his courtroom only an hour earlier had quietly given way to humility. Looking directly at the elderly veteran, he said, "Mr. Bennett, today I allowed incomplete information to shape my judgment. I questioned your integrity before I understood your history. For that, I offer my sincere apology." The courthouse remained silent as every person present waited for Harold's response. The old veteran looked at the judge for several thoughtful seconds before offering the same gentle smile that had never left him throughout the day. "Your Honor," he said softly, "a mistake made honestly can always become a lesson. What matters is what we choose to do after we recognize it." Judge Coleman lowered his head respectfully. "Thank you for granting me more grace than I deserved." Harold simply nodded. There was no bitterness in his expression because he had learned long ago that carrying resentment only made life's journey heavier. General Michael Hayes watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. This was never about proving someone wrong. It was about allowing truth to restore dignity without anger. Emily Carter stepped closer, still holding the small notepad on which she had written the fated serial number only a short time earlier. She looked at Harold with genuine admiration. "I almost let you walk away," she admitted. Harold smiled warmly. "But you did not." Emily glanced at the weathered oak box resting beneath his hand. "Thank you for waiting," Harold answered with calm simplicity. Sometimes the truth simply needs enough time to catch up. A few reporters respectfully asked whether they could photograph the medals. Harold paused before opening the old oak box one final time. Inside rested the carefully preserved decorations that had traveled through decades without losing their meaning. The afternoon sunlight reflected gently across the worn metal surfaces, revealing scratches earned through years of careful keeping rather than public display. No one saw objects of prestige anymore. They saw reminders of service, sacrifice, friendship, and responsibility carried quietly across an entire lifetime. After several photographs were taken, Harold closed the lid once again with the same careful movement that had begun the day. General Hayes extended his hand, but Harold surprised him by offering a brief embrace instead. The general returned it without hesitation. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said quietly. Harold smiled. "You became the leader you were always capable of becoming. I only pointed you in the right direction." General Hayes shook his head gently. Some directions change an entire lifetime. Together they walked toward Harold's aging sedan parked beneath the golden oak trees. Before entering his vehicle, Harold turned once more toward the courthouse. The American flag continued moving gently above the roofline as the afternoon breeze carried another wave of autumn leaves across the stone walkway. Judge Coleman stood respectfully beside the courthouse entrance. Emily Carter offered a grateful smile. Every soldier present remained quietly attentive until Harold settled behind the steering wheel. He placed the weathered oak box on the passenger seat, started the engine, and slowly drove away without ceremony or celebration. No escort followed him. None was needed. The people standing outside remained exactly where they were, watching until the old sedan disappeared beyond the courthouse gates. Long after the sound of the engine had faded into the quiet Virginia afternoon, no one seemed eager to speak. Some moments are too meaningful to interrupt with unnecessary words. They simply remain, becoming part of the lives of everyone who witnessed them. And on that ordinary courthouse lawn, one forgotten veteran reminded an entire community that respect is never created by medals, titles, or applause. It is earned through a lifetime of quiet character, preserved by truth, and remembered by those wise enough to recognize it when it finally stands before them.